All right, one more look at our judgments or beliefs, and we're still looking at this idea of justification of our beliefs. To know something, it has to be a justified, true belief, right? We have to have a belief. It certainly has to be true, but we also have to be justified. We have to have evidence for holding that belief, and we've been looking at the different kinds, right? Direct justification, indirect justification. Well, what counts as direct justification or foundational justification? Now we're just going to ask the question, is there really any foundational or direct justification after all? Like, does this stuff even exist, right? Of course, philosophers offering the accounts of foundational justification that we've just examined believe that there is such a level of basic or direct or foundational justification. But there are philosophers who reject the view that there actually is some foundational level or direct justification of beliefs by experience or by rational reflection. And we'll see that there are two kinds. There are two basic families of rejecting foundational justification. We'll call some just anti-foundationalism, and they come in a few flavors. One would be the coherence theory of belief justification. Coherence theory. What this says is there's no privileged human activity or mental state that immediately and all by itself justifies beliefs. Now, think about this for a second. Think when we were talking about inference and indirect justification. It was kind of this chain, right? This chain that went back to foundational justification. The testimony or inference traced itself back to things that were foundational, or at least that's one suggestion. This coherence theory says, no, you can't trace your way back like that to anything that's ultimately foundational. There's going to be no point zero or starting point one. Rather, what does it look like? Our beliefs come in networks, or webs, or clusters which mutually reinforce one another. So a justified belief is one that fits well into that web of beliefs, right? We all hold all kinds of beliefs, and we're justified in adding another belief if it fits well. These folks would say, is true even of perceptions, right? Think about this for a second. Yeah, maybe I usually feel that I'm directly justified in believing there's a tree outside of my window because I perceive a tree out of my window, right, with my eyes, with my sight. But they're going to say we never have any presuppositionless perceptions. That is, even when I'm seeing the tree outside of my window, I have this whole host of presuppositions accompanying it. Even our most concrete sensory experiences are colored by our background beliefs and suppositions. For example, my belief that there's a tree outside of my window, well, it seems directly and entirely justified simply by my looking out the window. It's really reliant on a host of other beliefs for its justification, such as my belief that trees look a certain way, or my belief that I'm awake and not hallucinating, or my belief that there's a physical spatial world outside of me. And each of these beliefs is supported and justified by a multitude of other beliefs to create a vast web of beliefs. Now, this one, just from my own standpoint, I'll interject here, this resonates with me. Coherence theory says we're justified in our beliefs when there's no loose ends, right? There's no outlying beliefs that don't fit with the others, right? But we're not justified in a belief that leaves loose ends, that just doesn't make sense with the rest of the universe as we understand it. In this sense, truth would be a grand tapestry, or a symphony. The truth would be symphonic. And I'm justified in holding beliefs together because of the coherence they all have together. There's, I think, something right about that. Maybe we can talk about that in class. Another anti-foundational theory here, that there are no ultimately foundational justifications, would be pragmatic justification of beliefs. This would say beliefs aren't justified because we get to something that's ultimately foundational in justifying them, but rather beliefs are justified if they work. That is, if they allow us to achieve the goals that we've set for ourselves, right? They get us to where we want to go. This is true for this theory, this is true of all beliefs, from our ordinary perceptual beliefs to the higher order beliefs of science, society, values, even religion. This being the case, no level of belief is therefore foundationally privileged for this way of thinking in such a way that it's immune from revision, right? So even my perception of a tree outside of my window, that belief that there's a tree outside of my window based on that isn't closed to revision, right? It's not that foundational. What if it stops working for me? So for example, it's useful to treat my experience, my perceptions, as if it were experiences It's useful to treat my experience as if it were of a world independent of my mind, right? We've had this whole question several times. Am I perceiving things out there in the world or only in my head? Well, this pragmatic theory of justification says, listen, it works really good to hold the belief that there's a real world out there. It avoids me getting hit by cars and falling off of cliffs, that kind of thing, right? It works for me. It's useful to categorize certain experiences as being of trees, sidewalks, cars, persons. It's useful to subscribe to moral and religious beliefs. It makes us good people or happier people. Similarly, the current beliefs of science are justified to the extent that they're useful. Here's the key. If these beliefs would cease being useful, we would discard them for other more useful beliefs. We probably all tend to do this from time to time as well. A third anti-foundational justification system would be, well, we could call it risk-benefit analysis, right? This is pretty narrow in probably in its application. This would say that beliefs which cannot be justified in other ways, ultimately grounding them in some foundational justification, they might be justified because it's the safer bet. It's the safer bet to adopt these beliefs than not to adopt them. So for example, this is Blaise Pascal, the philosopher Pascal. You might have heard of Pascal's wager. This is kind of what this is. Pascal believed that there was no way through experience, reason, or inference to justify our belief in God. However, he believed that it was, on balance, safer to believe in God than not, given at least the possible consequences in his mind of unbelief. In that sense, belief in God for him was justified. It was the safer bet. So here we have three kind of families of anti-foundationalism. They're just, sure, beliefs are justified, but they're not justified based on any foundational direct beliefs. Well, then there's another form of, or another school that would reject foundational justification, and that would be skepticism and the more extreme forms of skepticism. This would say there's no foundational level of justification for beliefs because ultimately there is no justification for any belief. This is extreme skepticism. You're not justified in holding any beliefs. We simply embrace the beliefs and belief systems of our preference without any justification. We don't need to have evidence. We just base it on emotion, right? Well, why on earth would someone hold this? Well, there's what's called the ancient trilemma, right? A dilemma is when you're stuck between two possibilities. A trilemma is where you're stuck between three possibilities, none of them good. The ancient trilemma says, well, there's only three ways to justify any belief. So take belief X, that my belief that there's a tree outside my window. There's only three ways to justify that. The first would be by a series of justified beliefs, right? We could have a series of justified beliefs, which one would go on forever in an infinite regress. I'm justified because of A, which is justified because of belief B, which is justified because of belief C, which is justified, etc., 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 on to infinity. And then there's really no foundational justification. Or 2, I have there's this series of justified beliefs which stops at some point at a belief that is not justified. Here we get back to something. This would be foundational, but look what happens when you get to the foundational. That itself isn't actually justified. That's, they say, the problem with foundational beliefs, right? I believe that I'm having a sense perception of a tree. Well, what grounds that belief? Ultimately, it's unfounded, right? That's, on the one hand, the people who say there are foundational beliefs say, well, that's it. It's foundational. The ancient trilemma says, well, look, it's unfounded. And that's, they say, a problem. Or 3rd, we have a series of justified beliefs which go in a circle. Instead of going all the way back, infinitely back without any first, or instead of coming to something unfounded, we go in a circle. We believe A, and that's justified because of belief B, which is justified because of belief C, which is justified because of belief A. We just walk in a circle, right? All right. Therefore, human beliefs, they say, are not justified. They simply are adopted for this or that motive, perhaps. Another school of skepticism would be Descartes. Descartes' famous reason for doubting human knowledge and, by extension, justified beliefs. Now, he's eventually going to get to I think, therefore I am, right? This foundational rationalist belief. But what was his method? It was this universal doubt. He looks at our beliefs and says, look, there's this pervasiveness of human error. People are mistaken all the time, so we need to doubt, right? We need to start with doubt. We need to establish certainty by starting with doubt. He says, well, listen, it could all be a dream. When I have a dream, I hold things to be true that aren't, and I think I'm justified. Well, maybe I'm dreaming right now. Right? Or the possibility that we're systematically deceived by an evil genius, sort of demon, right? How do I know that the whole world around me isn't constructed by some evil genius, right? This is skepticism. Says, you can't prove that that's not true. You can't prove that you're not a brain in a vat somewhere being stimulated, and all this is an illusion. So this is a kind of a radical form of skepticism. Another is Hume's critique of induction, right? A lot of what we believe is based on induction. I experience 10 pink flamingos or 100 pink flamingos, and I come to the conclusion that all flamingos are pink. We do this all the time. It's called induction. It'll be one of our topics for next time. Well, David Hume critiques induction and says that this doesn't actually justify any of our beliefs. Hume suggested that we have no actual rational justification for believing that the regularities and patterns of the past and present will continue to hold in the future. Even things like every physical object obeying the law of gravity, right? So I see 100 or 1,000 or 1,000,000 pink flamingos. He'll say there's actually no logical reason for saying that the 1,000,001st flamingo will be pink, right? I'm making some irrational leap. Or I've seen every object in my life fall to the ground following the law of gravity. He says there's no rational proof that the next one will. You're just making this kind of blind leap, right? We'll talk about induction next time. This is all called induction. We'll talk about that next time and why it justifies our beliefs. He says that if we say that belief is justified, right, that the ball is going to fall based on gravity, right? If we say that that belief is justified by the fact that such regularities have always held, that we're begging the question. That's what he calls it, begging the question, which is a logical fallacy. What's begging the question? We're offering as evidence that laws and patterns will continue to hold. We're offering as evidence for that the fact that laws and patterns have always held, right? We're offering for evidence the conclusion that we're trying to get to. But Hume's question is precisely why we should expect the laws and patterns of the past will continue to hold in the future. Okay, more skepticism. Well, there's modern idealism and skepticism. We saw in part 1, we encountered philosophers who doubted that our ideas really revealed how reality actually was outside of our minds. right? They said maybe all we really can be sure about is the contents of our own minds and not the world around us. But if that doubt is warranted, then we can't have any justified beliefs about how things are in themselves. Remember, this is the critique of Immanuel Kant, or the skepticism of Immanuel Kant to things out in the world around us. So what response can we make? Well, not surprisingly, there have been major philosophical efforts to show that skepticism is mistaken. Unfortunately, we just don't have the time to examine these in our efforts. Now, all of these questions that we've been talking about so far in these videos have been questions about direct, foundational justification. What about questions about indirect, derivative justifications? Things like testimony or inference, right? Testimony. More specifically, what are the requirements for belief based on testimony to be justified, right? Well, what justifies me to think that someone's credible and therefore to accept their testimony as justifying my belief? Right? Specifically, what are the marks of credibility in a witness? We're going to briefly examine these, how these questions bear on Christian faith in our discussion of applications in class. Because as you can imagine, Christian faith is based largely on testimony. We call it revelation. So we'll look at that in class. And then also, what are the rules? We're going to talk about inference. What are the rules for logical inference from one set of beliefs to another, from premises to conclusions? Well, that's the science of logic, inductive and deductive logic. That attempts to answer those questions. And that is our topic for next time. We're going to examine some of those issues in part 3 of the course. So for now, we're done with judgments. We're done with judgments and justification.